Story Bugs!
Hello and welcome to Storytime. Thanks for joining me. We are going to read Mrs. Merryweather's Letter, written and illustrated by John Patience and published by Tailwater Press. This one has beautiful pictures. Oh, let me show you the front picture. Okay, Mrs. Merryweather's Letter. Mrs. Merryweather, who lived in Poppletown, had just finished writing a long letter to her friend in Fern Hollow. She signed the letter with a flourish of her quill pen. Your very dear friend, Matilda Merryweather. P.S. The weather here is wonderful. It's raining cats and dogs. Putting up her umbrella, the happy duck splashed her way along the street to the post box. The raindrops made little bubbles in the puddles, and the oil from the traffic made rainbow patterns in the streams which ran down the gutters. Mrs. Merryweather began to sing, Quack, quack, the rain pours down. This is the weather for me. Let it patter and pour and drizzle galore, and a happy duck I shall be. Off you go, she said, popping the letter into the box, and she waddled back home again. By the next morning, Mrs. Merryweather's letter was in Mr. Periwinkle's mailbag, along with all the other letters he had to deliver. The weather in Fern Hollow was very windy, and Mr. Periwinkle was having considerable trouble in pedaling his bicycle. Suddenly, as he turned the corner by Boris Blink's bookshop, a great gust of wind caught him and blew him over. The letters spilled out of his bag and blew away down the street. The poor mailman hurried after them and managed to catch all but one. And that was Mrs. Merryweather's letter. It sailed away high over the rooftops. At the watermill, Mr. Croaker was busy loading his barge with sacks of flour. He had to walk along the plank from the riverbank onto the barge. This required a good sense of balance. Unfortunately, Mr. Croaker completely lost when Mrs. Merryweather's letter blew past him. Thinking the letter might be something important, Mr. Croaker made a snatch at it and fell into the river. Mrs. Merryweather's letter danced away on the wind over the tops of the trees. Poor Mr. Croaker, he's probably wet. Farmer Bramble emptied the bucket of swill into the pig's trough. Eat up, he said. Grunting with pleasure, the pigs began to gobble up their food. Just then, out of the corner of his eye, Farmer Bramble caught sight of something fluttering by. It was Mrs. Merryweather's letter. I wonder if that's for me, he cried. Leaping over the wall of the sty, he grabbed a pitchfork and rushed after the letter, trying to catch it on the prongs of the fork. But Farmer Bramble quickly ran out of breath and puffed his way back to the pigsty, where he found he had left the gate open, and all the pigs had run away. He's going to be busy now. Mr. Chips was busy painting the front of Brock Gruffy's shop when along came Sigmund Swamp, who was in a rather daydreamy sort of a mood. Sigmund didn't notice Mr. Chips and walked right under his ladder. That was very unlucky. At that moment, Mrs. Merryweather's letter came floating by and blew right into Mr. Chip's face. The startled beaver almost slipped off his ladder, and he dropped his can of paint, which fell down with a great splash on the top of Sigmund's head. All that day, Mrs. Merryweather's letter blew around the village. Lots of people tried to catch it, but no one succeeded. At last, as evening came, the wind dropped, and the letter fluttered down to rest in a bird's nest. The bird itself was fast asleep and didn't notice the letter slip quietly in beside it. When the bird woke up the next morning, it was very annoyed to see the letter cluttering up its nest and quickly tossed it out. Airborne again, Mrs. Merryweather's letter went fluttering over the railway station, where just then a train was arriving. And who should step out of one of the carriages but Mrs. Merryweather? The duck didn't notice her letter flying by, but handed her ticket to Mr. Twinkle and waddled out of the station. I don't see, oh, there she is, right there. Mrs. Willowbank was busy scrubbing her washing. Suddenly, through the open window, in blew Mrs. Merryweather's letter. Mrs. Willowbank picked up the letter and saw that it was addressed to her. "It's from Matilda," she cried. "She's coming to visit me this morning." As she spoke, there was a at the door. It was Mrs. Merryweather herself. "I see you got my letter," she said. "Yes," replied Mrs. Willowbank. "It arrived by airmail." Soon the two friends were sharing a pot of tea and a lovely plum cake, and wondering how on earth the letter had managed to deliver itself without any help from the mailman. I guess that letter knew exactly where it was going. Thank you guys for joining me for this story, and I hope you come back for another one. We'll see you next time. If you guys enjoyed reading that story, would you please click subscribe down below? We read new stories just like this one every day, and we would love to let you know when there's a new story to listen to.